Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how to square the end grain of a board using a hand plane, both with and without a shooting board. Hope you enjoy. So why do we want to use a hand plane to square the end grain of a board? Can't we do that with a handsaw? Well, technically even the most accurate hand sawing is still not going to be 100% accurate. You really need the referencing using something like the hand plane sole to actually achieve a nice square edge that's nice and smooth along the end grain that allows you to then use your marking out tools or layout tools to lay out joinery such as dovetails on the end of your board. It's even important if you're just doing a butt jointed box, for instance. So you want that to be nice and square so when you put it together there's no gaps in your final end product. So in order to do that, we obviously want to be checking our board using a square. Now, I'll show you a close-up of this one in a minute so you can see where we start. First up, what I'm going to be doing is just putting the board in my vise here and squaring it up using a hand plane without the shooting board. Typically, I would reserve this for boards that are much wider or too wide to go on the shooting board or just too big and cumbersome. However, I'm going to show you with the smaller board, which, yes, would be easier to use the shooting board, but if you don't have a shooting board yet, or you're squaring up your fence to create your shooting board, you're going to need to know how to do this freehand. So, jump in here and we'll get started. If we have a look at this, I'm going to be using this as my reference edge. I'm coming off this reference edge, and with the square on here, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little bit of unevenness. It's touching this on the board up this edge, and there's a little fine gap of maybe 1 millimeter right through the rest of the board. So from about this point just here, right through, is not square. So in order to bring that in square, what we're going to have to do with the hand plane is take down this high point here. Because this is in contact, this is now the high point, and we need to bring it down as low as this point over here to square it. So we're going to be using a hand plane. We're going to come in from both edges so we don't blow out the end grain. And I'll explain what blowing out the end grain actually is just before we get started, just so you know what to look for. So we have a nice fine set on the hand plane. And you can hear that it's only taking a very wispy shaving, which is what we want when you're doing end grain. Now, blowout is wait. You're going to come through like this, and you're going to hand plane all the way through. Now, sometimes it's a little more exacerbated than this, but you can see that this grain is kind of pushed over. This is essentially what the tear out is that you can get on the edge, or the splitting out on the corner. And that's what you want to avoid, because the hand plane catches these long fibers, grabs in behind them, snaps them off, because obviously you're hand planing in one direction, so the fibers are higher at this end than this end, and it can snap out like that. This is what we're trying to avoid by having a properly set blade, and using a shooting board actually helps to prevent this, because you've got a fence pushed up against these fibers, so you can actually hand plane through. Because these fibers are supported, it's very difficult for them to split out. So in order to do this, we want to make sure that we have our hand plane set with the blade nice and square. Now, to shoot square the end of a board, ideally, I think you need to have a nice square blade that doesn't have a camber on it. So if those of you out there that use a camber, I recommend you keep one that's flat for this job, because you don't really want any cupping in the end of your board. Although it might work, it's going to make it more difficult to actually get it flat, in my opinion. So we have our hand plane set up with a nice square blade. If you haven't seen that video, I'll leave the link to the video where I did this, which was last week's video. So first of all, when you're doing this in your vise, you obviously want to know which side is square and which side you're actually going for square and where it's out of square. I know that this side is high, so this is where we're removing the material. So splitting out on this particular board is going to be less likely, because we're removing the material this way, so we don't really want to bring any back that way. If you've got a board that is out of square the other way, what you can do is come in like this, and you do a few little movements like that, so you've just slightly undercut this edge. So when the hand plane comes through, it doesn't blow it out. Now that we've covered that, let's get to squaring this. So in order to do this, there are a few ways that we can actually hold this hand plane to do this. You obviously want to rest your hand plane, and you want to make sure that it's not tipping on that, and when you go, if you do come through on this edge, tipping like that, but in this case we're not going to come right through to this edge. So we want to make sure that we're not angling it like this to make it worse. We want to make sure that we've got this reference piece here that we've already made flat on this hand plane is held down on the board. Now, what I've got here is I'm holding this hand plane down nice and tight, referenced on that front section with the blade hanging off. Now, obviously, that's the way we do all our hand planing. The blade starts off the board usually. So in holding this, you can actually hold your thumb up on top here and reference with your finger just on the front here. That is one way that I like to hold it. Sometimes it works. On a shorter board like this, I like to bring my thumb down and do what's called a pinch hold, which is the same movement that you do when you're squaring a board's edge on the long grain. I like to do this because it gets the pressure where we want it. You can move to the middle of the plane or off to the side. So they're the two different ways that you hold it depending on how you like to hold it, obviously. But you can pinch up here or you can put weight here. In this case, on this one, because I'm going to be moving in the middle of the hand plane, my weight has my thumb here on top and my finger is just under here holding like that, which you can also use as a bit of a fence just to guide it and keep your hand plane straight in the same section of your blade so you're evenly squaring across. Now, we want to take little short sections like this So we're taking little movements like that, so we're only removing a little bit at a time and we're controlled in our movement of the hand plane and we're not just smacking it straight out the end. So we can see just here, my blade is still sort of back here, it's not off the edge yet. So to get this last little bit, you come in from this edge and go like this. And then you come back to this edge. So now that I've got to this point, I've smoothed across here. So we want to come back in with our square and check how square we are. Now, looking at this, because I've got the film light behind me here, and it's easier to check with the light behind you, the only spot that I've got light bleeding through is just right on this very edge here, which is probably when I undercut it to show you how to prevent the blowout. So what I'm going to do is run the hand plane in here a couple more times, trying to bring it down, but stopping back here, not blowing right out on that edge. So we're going to try and bring the level from here down, from where I can see that it starts, which is about here. You can put a little pencil mark if you want, you don't need to. So I'm going to be coming through to here to bring this level from here all the way down until we reach the level that's at this edge here. And it may require one hit of the hand plane coming back this way, but you just got to be careful and go slow. You also want to clear out any fibers that sit inside here because you're going really slow, and on the end grain they tend to pile up. So now I'm not doing as many little movements. I'm coming through so I know where I need to stop and then lifting it off. Lifting it off. Lifting it off. Lifting it off. So you can do that, or you can do the back slide if you're confident enough, but sometimes, especially when I was beginning, I found that I ended up taking a little too far because the momentum of the hand plane just moving through, you tended to go a little too far. Now, you will have seen that I just twisted the hand plane slightly here. Now, not only does that give a little more reference on the sole, so you can actually keep it a little flatter, it changes the angle at which the blade approaches the wood. And without turning this depth adjuster back here, we're actually cutting from one edge in, and the blade goes ever so slightly deeper, so it allows you to get a slightly more aggressive shaving without actually making it any deeper. And then you also have the ability to come back square again and go to that finer cut. So, because I have to remove quite a bit, that's why I've done this. So you're just coming back and forwards like this, checking it. And now, it's only out of square to about here. So we've taken about half of that gap that was out of square off, so we've got to take a little more material. So I'm going to angle it once more, find that reference, make sure you hold it nice and flat. Now this entire time you want to make sure you're coming right back off to the edge, so you're hand planing the entire load, the entire edge. So we're starting to get there. Now it's very close, it's only a little tiny amount, so what I want to do is come in from this edge now, reference up on the flat part that you're already removing material off, and little tiny strokes and then slowly get larger with these strokes, stopping about 10 mil in from the edge. Now I'm going to come in from this side, do a few strokes there, so now we should be flat right through. Now if we check this, it is very close to square. We've just got a little bit of a hump in the middle here, so I'm just going to work a few strokes in the center here. Now it does happen because you're coming from both directions on this, you can get a little bit of a hump because you're never going to be able to keep this 100% flat. Although you're referencing, because you're only referencing on such a small area and on such a small board, it can be more difficult to keep that reference all the way through. So sometimes you get a bit of a dome coming from both sides. So you've just got to watch where that is and then hand plane that out of it. So in this case, it starts here, stops there. So it's just this middle section here. So because I'm referencing on this high point here, I can still go off the edge of the board and it doesn't really matter too much. But you can come into where you need to start and hand plane like this. So we still want to come in from both edges. And now we bring the square down. And this is almost perfectly square now. I can see an ever so slight pinhole gap at this edge. If you've got a pinhole gap like I can see there, it's a little difficult for me to show you it, but it is a fraction of a millimeter and that's never going to be a problem. If you're on a shooting board, you're probably not going to end up with that issue. However, when you're freehanding it like that, best is going to be as good as you can get, and you don't want to go too far and wreck it and have to keep going and spending all your time on it. It's now square enough that you can actually use that board for referencing any joinery and you're not even going to notice any of the differences. The other thing you need to check is that you're actually square this way, and if your blade is square, you're going to stay square this way. In this case, this has stayed square. It was already square to start with, and because I was working right in the middle, all of the measurements and everything was going right in the middle. And you shouldn't have too many of the problems if your board is already relatively square that way. When you shoot it like that with a blade that's already square in your hand plane, it's going to stay square. Now, if we're out of square this way, shooting it freehand on a hand plane like this becomes very difficult to counteract that square, and that's where I find that the shooting board really shines. We'll turn this board around, and I'll use the other side of it, and I'll show you how we square it up on the shooting board. So first of all, what is a shooting board? Shooting board, as you can see here, has a track for your hand plane to run in. You've got a little lip so your hand plane can make contact up above the little offset that you see here on the blade. We're counteracting that. And we have a fence held 90 degrees to this lip. This is made out of MDF here, plywood, and then just a hardwood fence. Now, I'll leave the video link to the video where I made this down below if you want to make your own. But just know it's a fairly stable, and that's why it's made out of man-made materials on the base, which is just MDF and plywood in this case. The whole thing could be made out of plywood. I believe that Rob Cosman makes his shooting boards almost entirely out of the MDF, but I'll leave that up to you to have a look at his videos and see what he says about that. Now, when it comes to shooting square across, we do have specialist hand planes, and we'll talk about this one a little bit more later on because it's not a beginner tool. This is the Veritas right-handed shooting plane. It is set 90 degrees here, perfectly 90 degrees. So when you bring it onto your shooting board like this, it's referenced and it stays 100% 90 degrees as you push through. This one is designed to have another little strip on the back here, which I haven't added. You can still use it without that strip, but it means that you could have a track that this runs in and it stays running in. The reason I have this shooting plane is that not one of my vintage hand planes that I've got here actually has the wings squared to the sole. And while you might be able to square them up, I don't like that idea of material and stuffing around with the wings, because the traditional hand planes, when they were made in their castings, they were never 100% squared to the side because the wings were never used to reference. The shooting boards came along quite a bit later, as I understand, and have become very, very popular among the YouTube community for shooting the board square. I believe most squaring was done back in the day, was done in your vise, just freehand and by eye. But this jig does make it a lot easier for a lot of beginners to get in. So today I'd like to say that the wings are square on my brand new Stanley Bailey, but even on this they're not. The only hand planes that you'll probably buy these days that have a dead square is, I believe, some of the Lubin hand planes do, and I'll try to get my hands on one of them to do a review at some point to let you know whether that's true. And if you go to the more premium planes like Lee Nielsen and Veritas, they, because of their premium price and the way that they're machined, they are squared 100%, and if they're not, you should send it back and get a replacement. I'm going to use my shooting plane today to show it. The process is identical. If you were to use a normal hand plane, you're literally just running it like this, so it's actually no different. What you want to do when you square these is you want your reference face against the bottom and your reference edge up against here. Now, it's not 100% that you need to have your reference face down against the bottom, but it does work a little bit easier doing that. As long as your reference edge is against there, when you put your square back on, you know it's going to stay square. So what we're doing here is we're holding it down and we're going to push the board up against the fence. Now, the hand plane is going to push it against the fence as well, so we don't have to hold it as hard as if you were sawing on a bench hook. You're just holding it in place, and you want to keep it down flat so it stays referenced against the bed of your shooting board. Now, if they're out of square this way or in the other direction, so if they're out of square this way or this way, the shooting board will correct it. Because you've got a nice square blade in your hand plane, it's going to correct any out of squareness. So what we want to do is push our hand plane in and push it up against our little reference lip that's just here. And then we get our board pushed up against that, and we want to push that board against the sole of your hand plane. And then you're going to work through, and if it stops taking it and you can see that it's still not square, you're just going to push the board against it again. As you're running on your hand plane as well, you want to clear any shavings that sit here, because that could obstruct your blade and your hand plane. So I'm pushing it that way and against it, pushing it that way up against the fence to keep it referenced. And with the hand plane, you're pushing the hand plane in against this little lip that's just here, because that's your reference. And you can hear that I'm making a full width shaving, which is an indication that it's getting close to completely square. So once I'm happy that I've gone far enough, or if you've got a reference line that you're going against here, and you've reached that reference line, you know that it's square. Now, I did say that it pretty much eliminates blowout. You can see that there's a little bit of a feathery thing here, and you can do that by reversing it and taking one shave back the other way. But I don't like to do that. Some people do like to just take a little divot off here. The only reason I don't like to do that is that if this side is not square, then you've got a problem. Now we can see here that although I was taking a full width shaving, we've still got a fairy bit just here, which means we haven't come all the way down, so it's still not 100% square. It's square along this back edge just here, but it's probably not square along this front edge. So I know without even putting a square to it that we want to make sure that we've got this nice smooth fibre that you see here all the way along in here. So we're going to continue until that's done. So you see this build-up of shavings here? We want to make sure that we keep that clear out of the way. And some people, when they make their shooting boards, will actually have a little sort of dust ridge here. I don't find I'd produce any dust, and you shouldn't be producing dust on your shooting board, so it shouldn't be an issue. You just want to make sure that you're keeping that pushed right up, and if any shavings are getting down in here, they're going to put your plane out of square because you're referencing, and it's a fairly accurate squareness to your hand plane. So you can see if you're using this style, I hold it like this, so I'm keeping pressure against it because I don't have the extra rail. If I had an extra rail, I could just run straight because this is parallel, this hand plane. If you're using this style on here, the way you hold it is, I like to hold over the lever cap like this, and then on the top. Some of the longer ones, if you're using a number 5, you can actually just grab the wing because it's got a little clearance on it. You can sometimes just grab here or back here. And if you're using a low angle, some of them actually have an attachment, and because the blade is down low out of the way, you can fully grab that edge. We've now smoothed all the way through. There's none of those rough fibers. And I need to take my correct reference edge. And if we look at that, it's dead square. You can see that we're dead square along there as well. So that little bit of roughness that I showed you earlier, that's a good indication of how that a shooting board can bring you back into square this way, whereas if you're freehanding it, it's much more difficult to get that back into square. If your board is already relatively square this way, freehanding it is an easy way to bring it back into square, especially if you've got really, really wide boards. If you're going as wide as 200 mil or more, putting it on the shooting board becomes more problematic because it's harder to hold it in your shooting board and you lose referencing. If you had a really wide or long shooting board, you could still do wide boards. However, it's going to be easier sticking with smaller boards that are probably no wider than about 150 mil is probably the widest I've used on a shooting board. Maybe some of you that have been doing this for a while might have put quite a wide board on a specially made shooting board or something like that to deal with wide panels if you're doing a lot of panel work. So I'd love you to leave that in the comments below if that's the case. So there you go, folks. As you can see, it's really pretty straightforward to square a board up, particularly if you've got a shooting board that you've made. And I will leave that link down below, as I said, for you to build your own shooting board. I think it's very important that early on you know how to square up your boards and get a nice shooting board ready to go. So as you can see, it's fairly straightforward to shoot the board, whether you're using a specialist shooting plane or a standard Stanley Bailey or even bedrock design. If you've got one square to the wing, and it's vital that you check that it's square to the wing, otherwise you're not going to get a square result. It's also vital that you square that blade up to the sole. If you've watched my video, you know how to do that. So you really need to do that before you move on to this sort of stage. So if you like this video and you'd like to support me, please consider liking and subscribing down here. It really does help the channel out more than you know. And I'd love any of you to comment down below if you've got any questions related to this video or any of my other videos in the beginner series. You can leave that in the comments below. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon. Links in the description below. You get some behind the scenes with that, so that's up to you if you'd like to do that and check that out. And if you'd like some more videos like this beginner video here, please check out the video on the screen here right now, and I will leave my beginner playlist to all the videos that I've done in this beginner series up here as well for you to peruse. Bye for now.